are you people?
Following my recent React stream to clips of the amazing digital circus and some of the philosophical implications of the last episode's reveal, I ended up discussing interesting aspects of the philosophy of the mind and philosophical anthropology. Philosophical anthropology is the philosophy of the human being, that is, the question of what makes a human person. In the time since my TADC stream, I've had the thought that it might be helpful to make a more YouTube-friendly video format providing an introductory explanation to the basics of philosophical anthropology and the philosophy of the mind. In particular, I thought it might be helpful to discuss the common dualism versus materialism dichotomy that questions of the mind and the human person are often centered around contemporarily, why this can really be thought of as more of a false dichotomy, and, as discussed in my TADC stream, how a more classically Aristotelian view known as hylomorphism can be thought of as a helpful third position, freeing oneself from the false binary of dualism and materialism, and providing an account for the human person, which is both substantially unified, or in other words, not dualist, yet simultaneously goes beyond and avoids the many issues of a purely materialistic account of the mind and person. So, first things first, what do I mean when I use phrases like dualism and materialism, and how do these two views form a false dichotomy with one another in contemporary discourse? Dualism refers to the view that the human person can be thought of as a composition of two wholly separate substances, that is, two separate things bound to one another through some kind of a system of causal interaction, the body and the mind or soul. Traditionally, a dualist would understand the self as being a purely abstract and immaterial intellect, a mind which exists separate from the body. The body, in this sense, is an object, entirely distinct from the mind, which the mind, or soul, acts upon and pilots as some sort of a meat puppet or organic machine. Almost as if the body were some kind of a biological video game avatar, and the mind the player of the game, piloting the avatar around through a video game controller. In ancient Greek philosophy, dualism is often associated with Plato and Socrates, who conceived of the soul as not only separate from the body, but even, in many ways, almost hindered and obstructed by the physicality of the body, which imprisoned the rational soul of the human being within a world of constant physical change and particularity, unable to fully access the intelligible realm of universal, immutable, immaterial form, which Plato regarded as the most fundamental basis of reality. Socrates represents this dualist view rather well in the form of a common troll he liked to play on the people of Athens. It is said that in wintertime, Socrates would deliberately walk around Athens lightly dressed for the cold weather, literally for no other reason than to provoke people into inevitably asking him, "Hey, Socrates, aren't you cold?" This was all so that Socrates could then have an excuse to fire off the witty response he already had loaded in the chamber for just this occasion, wherein he'd say in response, "What? Who? Me? Oh no, I'm not cold. My body is cold, but I'm not cold." This language represents the underlying metaphysical assumption to dualism quite well. Notice how there is a clear and complete distinction made between the subject of I and the object of my body. All that falls under the conceptual definition of the subjective pronoun of I, me, myself, is entirely separate in its being from the object that is my body. The body may be my body in the sense that it belongs to me, like an object that I own, and thus has some kind of a unique and personal connection to myself. However, the nature of who and what I am remains nonetheless a purely immaterial mind and soul wholly separate from my body. Thus, the term dualism encapsulates the nature of the metaphysical relationship underlying any individual human being as two separate things, a soul and a body, forming a causal relationship between one another. Dualism is a philosophical view with a long history behind it, dating all the way back to ancient Greek thinkers like Plato and Socrates, and often making a prominent appearance in the philosophical traditions of other cultures, such as Buddhist philosophy in the East. However, in the modern world, dualism is most commonly associated with the significant influence of French philosopher René Descartes, who, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, famously defined the mind as a thinking yet non-extended substance. Non-extended here means immaterial. And the body, by contrast, Descartes defined as an extended, or in other words, material, yet non-thinking substance. Descartes goes on to define the self as existing entirely as immaterial thought, while relegating the body to the same category as non-rational animals, mere automata, effectively just organic machines operating without thought. Given just how widely known Descartes' name is, along with one of his most famous phrases, "I think, therefore I am," throughout popular culture to this day, it should come as no surprise that Descartes remains, for better or for worse, one of the single most impactful and influential thinkers on modern philosophy. One who profoundly shaped many of the dominant philosophical assumptions of the modern Western world. Likewise, the legacy of Descartes' strictly dualist account of the human person remains itself one of the most widely held assumptions throughout modern society about what something like a soul even is, by definition. Most people, when hearing the word soul, naturally assume a Cartesian dualist understanding of the soul as some immaterial, separate, and even foreign substance to the body. This is precisely what often contributes to growing feelings of skepticism many people have towards the existence of a soul altogether, as, given what modern science has come to teach us about things like neurology and the human brain, in a secular, scientific, and materialistic modern world, many, while assuming a Cartesian dualist understanding of the soul, tend to find the existence of such a ghost in the machine, so to speak, as dubious at best, effectively akin to an unnecessary add-on to the human body, no longer needed to account for the complexities of human thought and behavior in light of what we know about the human brain. This, of course, naturally segues into the other end of the false dichotomy, often assumed in modern understandings of philosophical anthropology and the philosophy of the mind, that being materialism. Materialism, more broadly speaking, refers to the metaphysical view that existence is entirely reducible to physical extension. In other words, the entirety of a substance's being is confined to its physical extension in space and time. There is no immaterial layer of existence under a materialistic worldview. To a materialist, physical extension and being are one and the same. To call something immaterial without physical extension is literally to render it non-existent to the materialistic worldview. As applied to the philosophy of the mind, this would be the view that the mind and the physical brain are one and the same. The entirety of a person's personality, thoughts, emotions, etc. are themselves entirely reducible to physical processes in the brain, how their brain is structured, how and which of their neurons are firing, etc. Thus, a materialist would reject the existence of a soul, or even a mind, at least in the immaterial sense of the term, in favor of the view that the entirety of what a person is not two things, but rather one thing: their physical body, which their brain is simply a part of. Friedrich Nietzsche, in the chapter titled Despisers of the Body, from his most famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, articulates this description when he states that, quote, "Body am I entirely, and nothing more, and soul is only the name of something in the body." This effectively summarizes the standard materialistic account of the mind and human person. One's existence is contained entirely in one's physical body and brain, and nothing more. And as Nietzsche states, the notion of anything like a soul is really just another way of conceptualizing properties of the body. For example, someone might use the word soul to refer to the collection of personality traits and features of their consciousness in an abstract sense, despite the fact that, to the materialist, such things are only ever accounted for as physical properties of their brain and nervous system. And thus, it is from the confluence of these two conflicting trends of modernity, the influence of Cartesianism on shaping a distinctly dualist assumption about what the soul is, along with the materialistic and anti-metaphysical assumptions of scientism, that modern understandings of and discussions about philosophical anthropology and the philosophy of the mind commonly reduce to a false dichotomy between Cartesian dualism and materialism. In other words, the average person in modern society often assumes the question of philosophical anthropology to be a binary choice between either a strong dualistic view of human beings as immaterial minds and souls interacting with the world through a physical body which they pilot as organic machines separate from themselves, or a strictly materialistic view of human beings as nothing more than physical bodies causally shaped by external factors in a deterministic fashion, with no soul or immaterial layer of existence whatsoever, and any notion of the mind or intellect as nothing more than the physical brain. However, such modern assumptions about philosophical anthropology and the philosophy of the mind are, in fact, based upon nothing more than a false binary grounded in common philosophical misunderstandings, themselves the inevitable consequence of the many failures of modern educational systems. While many thinkers prior to Descartes were some form of dualist, such as the aforementioned Plato and Socrates, neither dualism nor materialism constitute one of the most significant and influential accounts of the human person dominant in the classical tradition, that being more of a properly Aristotelian hylomorphic view, which, in fact, serves as an effective third position and alternative to both dualism and materialism, enjoying some of the strengths of both views without many of their weaknesses. First, in order to understand the hylomorphic account of the human person as Aristotle outlines it in De Anima, one first needs to understand the basics of Aristotle's physics and metaphysics. While understanding Aristotelianism would ultimately require a whole video in its own right, if not even a playlist of multiple videos, to briefly summarize, hylomorphism is a term derived from the Greek words hule and morphe. Hule, in Greek, literally means wood, though is also commonly used to mean something like raw material or stuff. Thus, in this context, hule effectively means matter. Morphe, in Greek, literally means shape, though in this context effectively means form. Thus, hylomorphism literally means something to the effect of matter-formism. Under such a hylomorphic account of existence, a substance exists, by its very nature, at the intersection of both matter and form. Matter, in the Aristotelian sense, is not to be confused with the modern, materialistic definition of matter as mere physical extension. Rather, when Aristotle uses the term matter, he is referring to the potential being of a substance, that is, the raw stuff out of which something is made. Form, by contrast, is the actuality of a substance, the specific shape and definition of what something is made into. In De Anima, Aristotle provides the helpful example of a wax and seal. Consider how letters used to be sealed back in the day. Someone would pour a small amount of hot wax onto the back of the envelope and then press the shape of a seal into it, so that it will cool into a seal bearing a specific shape or marking. If we treat the seal on the envelope as a substance, then the raw hot wax, by itself entirely amorphous and without shape or definition, would be its material, the stuff from which it was made, with the potential to be shaped into something actual or defined. By contrast, the shape and design of the seal pressed into the wax would be its form, the specific shape and definition informing the wax into a definable seal, the actuality of what the wax is made into. This serves as an analogy for all substantial being, wherein everything is always comprised of raw material potential from which it is made, and the definition of the form, shape, and actuality of what it is made into. Importantly, all substance, while existing of both material and form, exists nonetheless as one wholly unified substance. The matter and form comprising a substance are not two separate substances or two separate things in of themselves. Rather, they are the two aspects of the one thing made from and into what that thing is, one substance. Matter and form, therefore, are entirely inseparable from one another. Matter cannot exist without a form and actuality to what it is, with the concept of pure material, or prima materia as it's known in Latin, literally being only ever possibly existent and entirely unintelligible for that very reason. Aristotle would maintain that there is such a thing as pure form, or pure actuality, and that this would, in fact, quite literally be God, pure actuality without privation or change. But outside of God, nothing can exist without the material from which it is made, any more than it can exist without the form it is made into. Again, matter and form are inseparable from one another as one unified substance in this hylomorphic manner. With some of the basics of Aristotelian metaphysics now under our belts, let us return to the issue of philosophical anthropology. According to Aristotle, any living being exists in exactly the same way as any other substance, at the intersection of both matter and form together as one inseparable substance. This is what then leads to a considerably different account of what a soul is in the Aristotelian sense of the term, as contrasted with the Cartesian dualist assumption many people are used to in modernity. In De Anima, Aristotle defines the soul as simply the actuality of a living being. In other words, the soul is simply the form of a living thing. The body, by contrast, is the organic material of a living thing, which by itself provides the raw organic material with the potential for being alive. Yet it is the soul which actualizes a living organism into actually being alive. Just as any substance is an inseparable union of matter and form, so too a living thing is an inseparable union of body, as its organic material, and soul, as its actuality. This is what renders hylomorphism such an effective alternative third position to the false dichotomy of dualism and materialism. To be clear, the hylomorphic view is not a dualist view. The human person, as with any living thing, exists as one substance, whereas a dualist would treat the body and soul as two separate substances, two separate things interacting with one another in some manner. The hylomorphist understands that body, mind, and soul all exist as one unified thing. The dualist would maintain that you are entirely your soul, as distinct from your body, which is something else entirely from you, a mere avatar and organic machine through which you, that is your soul, interact with the world. However, the hylomorphist understands that while it is true that you are your soul, it is equally true that you are your body as well. Your body is as inseparably a part of you as is your soul and mind, rather than something distinct from you altogether. Yet, at the same time that the hylomorphic view rejects such a substance dualist account of the relationship between body and soul, it simultaneously rejects the strict materialistic impulse to eliminate the soul from the anthropological equation altogether and reduce everything to the body. The materialist agrees with the hylomorphist that you are your body, but then goes so far as to say that you are your body and nothing more, much like the previously mentioned Nietzsche quote. While the hylomorphist does not treat the soul as a separate substance from the body with its own bodily independent existence, the hylomorphist does, nonetheless, maintain that the soul exists as much a part of who and what you are as does the material body, insofar as the soul is the actual state of what the organic material of your body is made into as a living person. Thus, in conclusion, the human person, under the hylomorphic view, exists as one unified substance between both body and soul as they exist inseparably from one another, thus affording us a third alternative from the false dichotomy between dualism and materialism that tends to shape many of the modern assumptions about the philosophy of the mind and philosophical anthropology. The dualist says, "I am my soul and nothing more, and my body is something separate from me entirely." The materialist says, "I am my body and nothing more, and there does not exist an immaterial soul for me to have." However, only the hylomorphist enjoys the ability to say that I am both my body and my soul together, all at once, as one substantial being that is my person. And that is why I favor a more Aristotelian hylomorphic account of philosophical anthropology, as distinct from both dualism and materialism, a historically influential view that has unfortunately become less well known in the modern era, despite its strength in addressing many of the problems arising out of both dualism and materialism.